then I would like to present you all Jess Edberg. She is the executive director of the Dorothy Moulter Museum, and today she is giving a presentation on behalf of the Minnesota Alliance for Heritage Response. It's all about emergency preparedness, something that all of us are probably pretty familiar with as we live in quite a remote location that is prone to natural disasters of one kind or the other. So without further ado, Jess.
Hello, thanks for having me today. I learned and following the assignment from Dr. Bergam from last week, when she said she wants her presentations or classes to have three things. Interesting, which hopefully you're all here because you find this interesting. Chocolate, which I have on a tray in the back of the room. You can help yourself on your way out if you want. However, I can't say it's going to be super fun because we're talking about disasters, which I won't take a poll on whether you think that's fun or not. So what am I doing here? Why am I talking about this? We'll do it this way. I love how quick. Or maybe not. There you go. Okay. So I am a member and board member of a newly formed group in the state of Minnesota called the Minnesota Alliance for Heritage Responders. And we respond to things. So Minnesota Alliance for Heritage Response is the organization. And the goal is to be a statewide network, and we're working toward that, of museums, archives, libraries, performing arts organizations, historic preservation groups, emergency responders, pretty much any heritage organization that holds physical collection items, from archives to photos to actual objects. But it can also include anybody that's not affiliated with an organization that has a collection of items, antiques or historic photos at home, or records that you would be, really sad to lose. And the goal is we're dedicated to preparing for and responding to different disasters that would affect collections and historic properties. And so the Dorothy Moulter Museum, which is me right now, it's currently the only organization represented with the MN-AHR. And so I'm here to spread the word about what is this and what do we do and why is it important and why should you care and or be involved personally or with your own organization that you may be a member of, affiliated with, a board member, so on and so forth. So I wanted to share this picture. It's taken by a friend of mine, Tiffany Zemke. This is at Dorothy Moulter Museum. There's the museum down here. When we had that beautiful show of lights the other week. Why is this really relevant for us here in Ely? Is because one, we're a small community and we have really small organizations. And I don't mean not small by the impact, but small by physically small compared to other larger organizations such as St. Louis County Historical Society or the Minnesota Historical Society. And so we generally have minimal staffing. We generally have a fairly modest budget, which we generally stick very close to, which can result in a high risk to cost ratio if we should experience some kind of disaster. And so with that, it's really important for small organizations to look forward and plan ahead. So planning ahead, identifying other partners in your community, on your board and your membership base, regionally, nationally, also accounting for potential disasters in your budget. Do you have an emergency fund? Do you have money set aside if your computer blows up and all of your records were on it? How do you recover those? Risk mitigation. So identifying possible areas within your organization that could put you in a tight spot. And then incident management. What do you do if you have a situation? So historically, small organizations face a ton of challenges. I have a couple infographics here. These are from a report that was released in 2019 from the Institute of Museum and Library Services, the IMLS system, which you might have heard of. And it's called the 2019 Heritage Health Information Report. And it gives a lot of statistics about small organizations in general and how it can be really challenging for us to plan for emergency situations, disasters. But the good news is that in the last 10 years, so since right around 2009, 2010, is that we've kind of leapt forward in emergency planning. And so specifically, historically, back in the late 90s, the amount of small cultural or heritage organizations that had an emergency plan was around 10%. 2009, it was around 20%. And now more recently in the last 5 years, it's about 42%, which the number of organizations that fit into that range around 30,000 plus around the United States. So less than 50% of that is a higher number, but it's still not really great. Our goal is that every small organization, no matter what you do, has an emergency plan in place, even if it's just really basic resources that you have in your office. There's also a greater focus on what is the organization's financial responsibility if a disaster were to happen. So what is having an emergency heritage response? Basically, you could kind of look at it the same as like a medical emergency response. It's a structured and organized way of approaching a disaster scenario that's coordinated between multiple organizations and agencies. And so these are just a few examples of some heritage disasters that have happened. Primarily, a lot of these kinds of situations get more focused down in the southeastern and southern United States. And a lot of the cause of these disasters are hurricanes. But there are organizations like the Minnesota Alliance for Heritage Response around the world. There is a large network of responders focused on preserving our really important cultural heritage things. So who's all involved in this, besides me? So if you were going to experience, some kind of disaster here in Ely, let's say it's, the Ely Folk School, something happens, maybe a big windstorm rips the roof off. Of course, that institution is going to be the affected institution. So the Ely Folk School is kind of the center of this issue. We're also going to have our local EMS, police, fire department, any formally trained emergency responders. Then you have your volunteers and other individuals associated with that organization. So staff members, board members, members in general, concerned volunteers in the community that have time and energy to help. You might even involve local and national resources, for example, FEMA. And then we also have specifically heritage responders, both local, regional, and national. And I'll talk about the national one a little bit towards the end. MN-AHR is the local heritage responder organization that now exists in the state of Minnesota. And we also open it up to the Midwest. But before last fall, when I attended an actual training for this, there were only 2 other trained professionals in heritage response in the Midwest, one in Minneapolis and one in Chicago. So there's definitely a need for more people to be involved in this. Ideally, a response is going to be very organized. And again, like a medical response, you're going to triage, you're going to go, fix the worst case scenarios first, and then move down the line with a priority list. You're going to keep very detailed records of what's going on, finding spaces to organize everything. So for example, the folk school, we know we've got canoes there for the Minnesota Canoe Museum. Get the canoes out of there, find a place to put those canoes where they can safely be stored until the disaster has been responded to and we have next steps. Supporting, packing, and moving all of these things to those spaces, and then stabilizing them. One of the biggest threats to a lot of collections is mold. And for mold, it's a timing thing. You want to get to those items, take them to a safe place, and stop mold growth. Sometimes that means drying them out as quick as can. Sometimes it means freezing them. And this could be a few days, it could be a few months long process. But once you understand what needs to be done and how it can be done, that's kind of half the battle right there. And then treatment, rehousing, or discarding. You know, if you have a fire and your books are completely burned and there's no recovery, you're probably going to get rid of them. If you're a museum, you deaccession them. If you're not a museum and you don't have all these rules that you have to follow about cataloging, you throw them away. So that's kind of the last stage of this process. And there's more to it, of course. And there's a lot more detail to this process, but you know, we've got a little bit of time here, so I'm not gonna, that's where the fun part doesn't really come in this process. But in a situation, in a disaster emergency response, ideally, you are working off your emergency plan where you have taken into consideration what if and looked at plan A, B, C, D, and then all of the things. So if you are the Minnesota Canoe Museum, you have canoes in your collection. What are the specific things that you would need to do in the case of water damage? Well, maybe water damage would be such a problem for that. Fire damage, mold damage, you know, and have resources set in place in a book or online or somewhere that you can easily access and instruct people that are helping you to do it. So an emergency plan is going to include a variety of things. You're going to have roles. So a lot of the heritage response works off of incident command system, which is a government, you know, the government uses it, FEMA uses it, Forest Service uses it. A lot of organizations and agencies use it as a structured hierarchy of who's going to do what in an emergency situation. And so for our training, that's what we do as well. So we identify who beforehand is going to be the point of contact, who is going to be the media contact, who is going to be the person that is the liaison with local EMS services, who is going to be the person that is in charge of the books, of, you know, the objects. You list all of those in your emergency plan. And if you have a call list, so at the Dorothy Moultrie Museum, we have what's called a truck list. And this list is volunteers, staff members, board members who have an actual vehicle that's a truck or can hold large amounts of things. And it's our call list. So if we have a wildfire that's creeping up behind us, like we have had recently, we have a list. We can say, okay, can you come and get these boxes? And I need you to come and get these boxes and then take them somewhere else. And then of course we have a list of where that somewhere else is. Institutional profile. So for example, if we have a major disaster and I'm not the point person, but somebody outside of the organization is a point person, there's a profile of what the museum is, what it does, what we have there. So they have kind of a quick, you know, cliff note version of the museum. Response guidelines. So who should be the first on the scene to initiate the response? If it's not someone outside the organization. So for me, it's the Dorothy Moultrie Museum. I should be getting there as soon as I can. If we have a closure, so non-emergency closure, let's say there's a fire that's close, but it's not imminent. What do you do to prevent possible disasters? So kind of pre-planning for your emergency. What do you do in case of the XYZ? Is it a windstorm? Is it a tornado? Is it a wildfire? You know, did your pipes burst and leak all over your rare book collection? And then of course, health and safety. Again, got mold issues with a water issue. Health and safety is a priority. You don't want people inhaling, you know, chemicals or organic compounds that could do them some harm. What are your salvage guidelines? So now you move into, okay, the emergency has been contained, the fire has been put out. What's our priority list? What are the most valuable items that we need to get to first? And what do we do with them? And then have that priority list in place so that if I'm busy doing something else, a volunteer can look at the list at the Dorothy Moultrie Museum and know, okay, we need to get in the basement and get Dorothy's guest registries and get them out now. So details such as a priority list, assessment of the items, and then what are you going to do with them? Can you keep them? Can you treat them and preserve them? Or do you need to dispose of them, and how are you going to do that? As well as your insurance information. and an insurance policy or where that policy is located. What security measures do you have at your organization? Do you have an alarm system? Do you have security cams? What are the passwords? How do we turn them off if you're the first person on the scene? And then media tips. So, you know, Ely Timberjay comes by and they see that you're recovering and there's a ton of stuff going on. Somebody should be designated the one to speak to the media and have talking points that they stick to, so that nothing's getting out that you're not ready for, and you know what the messaging is going to be. So this would be in your emergency plan. Dorothy Moulter Museum has an emergency plan. This is what it looks like. I am happy to forward you, if you are working on an emergency plan, the Word document or the PDF version, and you can use it. Don't reinvent the wheel. We have already gone through it. The museum got a grant to create this plan, and we want everybody to be able to do it and do it as easily as possible, because getting that plan in place is really important. Most common disasters around the country are from water damage. Yeah, hurricanes happen, but here it's going to be a burst pipe, frozen pipe. Yep, your sprinkler system is on the fritz. I was at a meeting the other day and they were talking about how somebody went in to their archive room to replace a sprinkler head and forgot to turn the water off. There's a disaster right there. So a lot of things can happen to create a disaster for you. Electrical fires. This image right here is a humidifier that caught on fire and triggered the sprinkler system. So now you've got kind of a double whammy there. Theft or vandalism, and of course, human error and accidents, which you can never avoid. There's always something possible. In addition to the natural disasters that we kind of often think of when you hear the word disaster. So what do? Oh my gosh, you don't have an emergency plan. Start penciling in some time to work on an emergency plan. Like I said, I will send you my copy and you can just take out Dorothy Moulter Museum and put in your organization, whatever works for you. The kind of way that you want to come about this is to get your plan in place, or at least start, and then get supplies to implement your plan, and then stay vigilant. So updating your plan, revising your plan, training with your plan, talking about this plan with all the staff, the board, the volunteers that might be involved in a scenario like this, and making sure everybody's familiar with it, where they can find it, who has the emergency kit that you might use. Start thinking about those things. Your goal, and this could be at your organization, this could be at your house. It's a good plan to have regardless, is you want to mitigate. So do you have high risk? Do you have an alarm system at your organization where you store some very valuable things? Maybe you want to look into that, or at the very least, look into getting some cheap cameras. We ordered Blink cameras off of Amazon when they went on sale, and it's $30 a year to maintain them for the museum. But now we have a security camera system for right outside the buildings. We also have an actual alarm system too, but improving the infrastructure of wherever these really important items for you are housed. So mitigating potential risk. Preparedness. So how are you going to prepare for a potential disaster happening? Well, having your emergency plan is the biggest. And then of course, training and going through scenarios with your staff, with your volunteers, so that they don't need to know exactly what they need to do, but to be familiar with what could possibly happen. So going through it, getting people comfortable with the information that's in there, and updating it and revising it. So your executive director left and now you have a new executive director. Make sure you go in there and update all that contact information in your plan. I walk out the door and I get hit by a bus. Somebody else needs to take over. So making sure that those updates get in there, and making sure that all of your systems are up to date. Do you have a backup battery for your alarm? When's the last time you checked the batteries on your security lights outside? Response. So all those things that I kind of talked about before in the emergency plan, you know, how are you going to stabilize the incident? What safety measures do you have in place? How are you going to preserve any items that were involved in this situation? And then the assessment and salvage. And then recovery. Recovery is probably the hardest part to actually implement because this could take months or years, depending on how much stuff you have that you need to preserve or mitigate stuff, like mitigate mold growth. So prioritizing is important. You know, what items can you absolutely not lose for the integrity of your organization? What kind of economic recovery plan do you have in place? Debris management. You have a fire, you're gonna have a lot of stuff you need to get rid of. How are you going to do that? Where can you take it? So even just having Northwoods Transfer Station, phone number and website so that people know where to look for the hours and fees. And then a rebuilding plan. And this is, again, this is one of the hardest steps, and it doesn't have to be complete. It doesn't have to be 100% detailed, but just keeping it in mind is a huge step forward in the emergency planning process. How do you fund creating an emergency plan, knowing that you have all of this information you need to gather or create? There is money out there. The Dorothy Moulter Museum took advantage of this several years ago. It's still there. So through the Minnesota Historical Society, which manages the Clean Water, Land and Legacy Amendment funds through cultural heritage grants, has a grant specifically develop a disaster plan for up to $10,000. And this includes staff time, hiring an outside consultant to come in and help or do it for you. All of the work involved in creating a disaster plan can get funded. It does take time, but it's a good investment of your time. So if you go on their website, under grants, this would be a structured grant, and they encourage small organizations to apply for this. They really want us to have an emergency plan in place. And it'll get you to a point where you feel prepared and equipped to respond to an emergency in your organization. Once you create a disaster plan, then you can apply for a secondary grant to create a disaster response kit. Excuse me, so that's where I'm at. I'm submitting an application for that currently to create a disaster response kit. Right now I have a really kind of pitiful go bag, which was a gift as part of the training I went to last fall. And it has a hard hat, a high-vis vest, a box of gloves, and a bunch of paper and pens. And then I keep my emergency plan in here. But I'm working on an actual kit. And this is something as a heritage responder that I'm encouraged to have. And this would be located not at the museum. This would likely be located in my garage at home. Because if the museum starts on fire, what is my kit doing? It's burning up inside. So it's these things, copies of all these things are going to be at my home so that if I need to respond to my own organization, I have easy access to them. And the kit includes things like N95 masks or respirators. If you're dealing with a fire situation, you want to make sure that you are not inhaling residual chemicals or soot that's being, moved around from a lot of activity. I won't go into it because I want to make sure that there's time to finish this. But it's a huge kit that would be 3 totes worth of supplies and equipment, including absorbent pads if there's a flood so that I can start drying books, buckets to have water so that if I have a photographic collection, physical photos that get wet for some reason, I can put them in a bucket of distilled water and they can stay there for up to 48 hours until I can find somebody or somewhere to take them where somebody can then treat them and work to preserve them. So there's a lot of equipment in preserving items that normal businesses and museums just aren't going to keep around, like a soot sponge. How many of you have soot sponges at your work, unless you're at a hardware store? It's not something that most people keep around for emergency supplies. So this grant I'm asking for just under $3,000 from the state to fund creating this disaster kit. And anybody can do this as long as you have an emergency plan in place. So that if any of our community organizations experience a disaster, I can then take that kit and allow you to use it so that you have some of these resources. And the more kits we have in our small communities in outstate Minnesota, the more organizations we can help other than our own. There are also places where you can get training similar to what I went through, or access to self-serve training like webinars online, or online classes to go through, get FEMA certified as an incident command person. And that is through the American Institute of Conservation and the Foundation for the Advancement in Conservation. And these two organizations have a joint website, and they offer grants and scholarships to attend trainings like the one that I attended last fall, and the 8-week online course I took to go through emergency response. How do you mitigate these things? And they have a ton of other resources available. They're also a member-based organization. It's not cheap. It's an annual membership for me. If I wanted to continue my membership after my scholarship expires, it's about $200 annually. However, these are some examples of the coursework that you can go and take online from their website at your leisure. So if you want to learn about different insurance considerations, you should look into about your cultural organization. You can take, this class, and an actual collections insurance agent talks to you about, is your insurance policy adequate to cover if your organization has a fire? But let's be real. A lot of us don't have a lot of time and energy or staffing to jump right on these things right now. So what can you do with this very minute? This very minute, the Minnesota Alliance for Heritage Response has a huge amount of resources that are free on their website. So it's allianceforresponsemin.org. I also have a poster as you're leaving with a QR code. If you take a picture of it with your phone, it'll take you to the website where you can join an email list to be kept apprised on trainings or information. We are very, very new, so there's not a lot of it right now, but we're working toward creating an actual community of responders. So if you want to be involved in that or kind of be in the know in the future, join that list. But their website has tons of information, from templates, to sample documents, from preparedness, response, health and safety, additional sources for funding. You can also find this prep. Let's see, I have right here. So this is the pocket response plan. So this is an example. This is a blank one. I don't have a printer to print. It's like an 8x14 piece of paper, but there's a free template. So any entity, organization, or individual, you want to do this for your own home because you have historic photo albums in the basement that you would hate to lose, you can make this on your own. So here's an example of one from the Kansas Cultural Heritage Emergency Resources Network. It's a mouthful. It has a list of what are the priorities and then where are they located. Here's a little layout of the actual building with pictures of what are you looking for. So if, let's say I'm going on vacation and I have a board member who's agreed to be responsible for emergency response when I'm gone, I can make them this little pocket thing and have pictures specifically of the items that are priority items to take out of the museum if humanly possible without risk to health and safety. So this is, you populate it with whatever information, but it gives you a guideline to follow. So what are the emergency response contacts for Ely? Ely Police Department, Ely Fire Department, EMS services. What do you do if you have a hazardous waste problem? Who do you call? Also, who are the board members that are available to reach out to, and what are their phone numbers? And can you text or can you call them? You know, all the details that you would want to have available to somebody to help you in an emergency, you can make in this little pocket thing. You print them out, you fold them up, and you give them to everybody that you want to have one. So there's a super easy, free way to create a miniature emergency response plan right there. Again, there's also tons of guidelines available online. These are for free. So, you know, oh my gosh, it's an emergency. You're the first one there. What do you do? Here's a little guideline right here. It kind of walks you through so that you can mentally think about, if I'm in this situation, here's what I would do if I can remain calm and collect. Things like drying wet collections in buildings. You know, if you've never had your sewer back up in your basement, you know, which could certainly happen at your museum or your business, here are some tips on how do you deal with that? How do you dry these items appropriately? So there's a way you dry them at home, which, you know, I might just throw them out in the yard and let the sun do its work and then take them in. But if you're a preservation organization, there's a little bit more to it. So how do you do it to keep the item's integrity intact after a disaster? There's also printed resources. There is an actual field guide to emergency response. So this is available online for $25 through the cultural heritage organizations, which the ones that cost money to be a member, but you can buy off their website. You don't have to be a member for that. This is basically if you are a reader and you like having a physical book, this is kind of a guideline there. This is the salvage wheel. This is a super, super popular resource a lot of museums have. Basically, if you have an emergency and you need to figure out how are you going to fix some textiles, you have some really old you know, costumes at the theater that you want to preserve for historical purposes. Here's a little guide on what to do in an emergency to preserve those costumes. Books, digital files, slides. It's a really handy little guide here. There is also a working with emergency responders. You can buy it from them for $2, or you can email me and I'll send you the PDF because I scanned it. Don't tell them. But it's just a very brief few-page guide on working with your local emergency responders if you have an issue. Is Bradley here? Okay, so I talked with Brad Roy. He is the City of Ely Emergency Manager. This is the person who you should invite out to your organization, your museum, your area where you store these really important things that you don't want to lose, and walk through with. Show them you have an emergency plan. Would you like a copy? Working with your local emergency responders and inviting them to come out and tour your facility builds a relationship of one of your community partners. So should you have a disaster, they know that you have tried everything you can up until this point to avoid a disaster. But if a disaster happens, you have an organizational plan in place to be as effective and organized as possible. So inviting Ely PD and the fire department out to the Dorothy Moulter Museum is one of my things on my list in the spring once the snow is finally gone, to show them like, okay, if we have a fire and you have to break down the door to the basement of the museum's office building and shoot water in, please don't try to shoot water at this corner, because this is where some very old pieces of paper are and we don't want them damaged if at all possible. Or you need to break a window and get into a building, please try to break this window. You know, little things like that. Not that you expect them necessarily to remember those things in the event of an actual emergency, but responders, especially those working with cultural institutions or heritage institutions, will do their best to try to work with you on preserving what you have there. So Bradley Roy at ely.mn.us. He's actually coming out to the museum tomorrow afternoon to walk around and for me to show him what we have and what we're preparing for. So I would encourage everybody to do that as well. Talk with your your insurance provider or agent. So yes, we in, heritage preservation have items that are irreplaceable. How do you put a value on those items? You don't, because you can't replace them. You can, however, have insurance to cover mitigation and preservation. So if you have a fire and Dorothy's famous red snowmobile coat gets soot damage on it, we can't replace that coat to the historic value that it is right now, but we can clean it and try to preserve it as best as possible. But in order to do so, we might need to call in a professional who works with textiles to be able to do that, or send it to an organization or a vendor that specializes in dealing with fire damaged textiles. Those are things you can put in your insurance policy. Things like disposal. You need to get rid of a huge, trailer full of damaged items. It's not free. So having it in your insurance policy to cover the cleanup after a disaster can be really important too. And we all like to support our local community. And sometimes our insurance agent might not have the experience or knowledge or understanding of what it means to have an insurance policy for a heritage collection. So don't be afraid to ask really tough questions or to invite somebody from outside to come in and help consult or guide with insurance planning, because this is one of the big preventative measures for you financially to plan ahead for a disaster. Oh no, okay, tomorrow, what if we have a disaster? What do? Who recognizes this picture? The Blueberry Art Storm of July 2021. Yeah, so it can happen with only 2 minutes notice that something bad is coming. So what do? You have an emergency, you don't have, the fancy kit, you don't have a network of people set up yet. You can start by just mentally preparing. What are the steps to try to be as effective and efficient as possible in responding to your emergency? The sad truth is that if we have a major disaster here in Ely, we have a wildfire, all of our small organizations are going to be at risk. We're all pretty physically close to each other in the grand scheme of things. And so keeping that in mind, what do we need to prepare for, but what else can we do? And that is where I come in with the Minnesota Alliance for Heritage Response, but also the National Heritage Responders. So the National Heritage Responders respond to the needs of cultural institutions and the public during emergencies and disasters through coordinated efforts with first responders, state agencies, vendors, and the public. Basically, it's a big description for an organization that works very similarly to FEMA, but for cultural heritage. So it's a nationally recognized organization of responders, very similar to myself, that are on a registry that any organization has access to for free. So full disclosure, I'm not technically on the registry yet. I passed my exam, but they don't put people on the registry until May. So we'll see if I'm lucky. But like I said, they really need people in the Midwest and in areas, sometimes considered the flyover areas where there's not a ton relative to like the East Coast. But this organization is funded through a whole huge amount of funding sources, including the federal government. And it responds, again, very similarly to FEMA. And anybody can call them and request help. So if I at the Dorothy Moulter Museum have a catastrophic fire event, I am very likely going to call this phone number and ask for help to come out. So the help, they donate their time, the individuals do, but the National Heritage Responder Group covers travel, lodging, and meals. So it's a combination of volunteerism and also funding, but it's available both for individuals and for institutions or organizations. This information is at their website, so culturalheritage.org. And if you go to the resource page for emergencies, this is pretty much what that page is. And so this page should be in your emergency plan as a resource to go get some help. In the meantime, again, I'm Jess Edberg. I work at the Dorothy Moulter Museum, and I am our local ELE responder. I did attend the training last fall, but it was 2 days. So I am by no means an expert on mold mitigation or, things that happen in a disaster, but I do know what my resources are. I'm working on getting a kit, and we're trying to build a local network of people that are similarly trained. And so if you are interested in being on the mailing list, this is also that QR code that's on the poster at the back. But you can also go to the website, Alliance for Response, MN.org, and on the page, there's a spot that says join us. And if you click on that, it will take you to that page to register. If you want more information specifically, like now, Megan Narvey currently is the board president for the MN-AHR. And this is her email, megan.narvey@mnhs.org. She is a staff member at the Minnesota Historical Society. But we're trying to get people involved. And so the whole purpose of me being here today was to get your interests, get you to maybe a little bit afraid of a disaster, but get you thinking more about what are you going to do and how are you going to do it and how can you be more proactive with it. And so with that, I will stop talking at you and see if anybody has any questions.
Jess, can you tell us a little bit about what happened with the fire in the Dorothy Moulter Museum? How did you respond? What happened?
So the question was, how did we respond when there was the wildfire that was getting pretty close to the museum? That was before I worked there, but I do know that it was quite disconcerting. Sarah Guy Levar was the director at the time, and she initiated the call list. So she pulled out the truck list and started calling volunteers to see who was available that wasn't already occupied with protecting their own property, to be ready at a moment's notice to come to the museum and start evacuating precious collection items. Thankfully, it didn't get to that point. But that's kind of like the first page of our emergency responses. What do we do? And we mobilize, we call out and make sure people are aware, okay, we're in need. Can you be ready? We'll be in contact. That's about it.
That didn't get it.
Me too. Yes. Yes. My job would be very different right now, I think, if it did. Well, I must have been very thorough. Steve.
For home proactive stuff, I've learned, and I want to pass on, that the hoses behind your washing machine, they don't last for like 50 years. And they want to.
Yes, so risk mitigation here includes checking all of the hoses behind your washing machine. Or if you have very old pipes like we do you notice corrosion? Is there a point of contact where you might see a hole happen? Is the washing machine, has the vibration loosened up those hoses that are attached? So regular maintenance is part of that risk mitigation. Making sure that the infrastructure you have in place is not aged to the point where it needs replacing. You know, is your water heater on the brink of rusting out of the bottom? You know, a lot of those kinds of disasters could be avoided by regular maintenance that sometimes is recommended by the manufacturer and sometimes it's just something that you should do anyway to double check. Batteries in your fire alarm, that kind of stuff. Yes, dust and lint in your dryer vents, vacuuming out your heating ducts, all of those kinds of things. Oh,
I assume that there's a broader process if you're talking about property that you own, your organization. But what if, there must be a lot of people who have maybe valuables in storage units where you're really working with another level of ownership besides your own interests.
Yeah.
Do they address that?
so that is part of your emergency plan. So for example, we have storage of items that we don't have room for at the museum in the basement of the Franzen Bank building. And so we have included that offsite location in our insurance policy to make sure that if something were to happen to that building, that we have liability. You know, even if it's human error, you know, that we're covered with as much as we can be covered, but it's also on us to make sure that, you know, where's the sprinkler system located? Where are the water pipes? And maybe we shouldn't store items directly underneath them. Lifting them up off the floor on a pallet so that if there is a water event, that we have a little bit of time before the basement becomes entirely flooded. So that's definitely on us too, and something that we have to include in our emergency plan. And sometimes it can be really hard if you rent a trailer at R&R Transfer, there's not much you can do aside from prioritize what you store there and then how you store it. You know, is it a document in a firebox? Not that a firebox is going to survive every fire, but there's ways that you can kind of prevent some of that, but sometimes it's out of your hands. Well, thank you very much for your time. You. Again, feel free to get in touch with me either about getting free copies of the emergency response collaboration, our emergency plan, anything like that, and of course to get some chocolate on your way out.
Sweet. Thank you all for coming. I believe Lacey will be back next week, so you can ask her all about her trip to Brazil. Otherwise, feel free to come up if you have any other questions. Thank you.